It is now widely recognized that we are in an environmental crisis. There is nearly an unanimous agreement that the earth is getting warmer, and the consensus in the scientific community is that human activity, especially through activities that emit hydrocarbons, is the chief cause of climate change. The view that business has an obligation to respond to environmental crisis is becoming increasingly accepted. But what are the specific moral obligations of businesses regarding the natural environment? In the 1990s, business contributions to a more sustainable environment began to emerge. Many practices of business had been wasteful and inefficient. Business leaders saw that waste was a cost and thus that eliminating waste through recycling or alternative product development was a good way to be more environmentally friendly and more profitable, not only in the long run, but immediately. In Chapter 7, you're going to read about the environmental sustainability, law, and fairness. You're going to learn about the U.S. Environmental Protection Statutes. These statutes include the Clean Air Act of 1970 and the Clean Water Act. You're also going to learn about the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which sets up a cradle-to-grave program for the control of hazardous waste, regulating labeling, containers, transports, and disposal sites. You will also learn about the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or CERCLA, a liability scheme rather than a monitoring program. It's created a $1.6 billion fund, a super fund, to help finance the cleanup of toxic waste sites when the polluters would not or could not pay. The market-based approach to environmental harm includes the cap and trade, also known as emission trading. This government's regulatory program determines the limit or sets the cap for the maximum level of emissions of specific chemicals during a private business activity. Take California, for example. Under the cap and trade model that was launched by the state in 2013, a regulatory board sets statewide limits on emissions of the industries responsible for 85% of California's carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas output. As of mid-2016, this state's cap and trade system is the most comprehensive in the world and is dubbed to be a success. At the end of its first compliance period, emissions have fallen 3% and billions of dollars have been generated by the allowance auctions for environmental projects, over half of them in disadvantaged communities. And California's carbon market is not hurting its economy. You also read about the international response to climate change, which is very different from the United States response. In 1988, the United Nations formed the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, composed of leading climate scientists from around the world. The IPCC has been producing reports at regular intervals since 1990, collecting and assessing data. The fifth report, which was completed in 2014, summarizes findings, stating that it's extremely likely that human influence has been the dominant cause of observed warming since the 1950s, and the concentration of greenhouse gases has increased to levels unprecedented on Earth in 800,000 years. Through the 1990s, as nearly 200 countries reached agreement on the Kyoto Protocol, the world's first treaty to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the United States declined to join in. The Kyoto framework committed ratifying nations in the developed world to phased in emission reductions, with restrictions on developing countries to follow. Although the United States has not made sustainable business a matter of public policy, many business leaders have argued that business must take a leadership role in responding to the environmental crisis. For example, in 2007, a group of 27 corporations and environmental organizations formed the United States Climate Action Partnership, in response to inaction on the part of the Bush administration on climate control. The Paris Global Climate Agreement of 2015. In December 2015, nearly 200 nations came to an agreement to reduce their greenhouse gas emission. Learning from the failure of the past United Nations climate conferences, the so-called Paris Agreement employs a bottom-up instead of a top-down approach. Rather than setting emission limits uniformly for all nations, each country will be able to set its own goals and to work toward them in their own ways. What is required is that all nations must report on their progress toward lowering greenhouse gas emissions. Private property regulation and constitution will be discussed also in Chapter 7. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution states that private property may not be taken for public use without just compensation. The power to take private property for public use is called eminent domain. The Fifth Amendment is the only part of the Constitution that explicitly protects private property owners' economic interests, and it has been an important battleground over years as courts have had to define public use and also just compensation, and especially in recent environmental cases, the concept of taking. Since the passage of the National Environmental Protection Act in 1970, regulatory takings challenges have been brought by private property owners who believe that environmental regulations unfairly burden them as individuals with the cost of protecting our natural resources. Environmental justice. Environmental justice now is a global movement, and it refers to ethical issues at the intersection of race, class, discrimination, and environmental harm. Vulnerable communities who have been marginalized by discrimination or poverty are typically affected more severely than the rest of the population. Less able to gain access to important information and excluded from participating in decisions that deeply affect their health and safety, they are more burdened by environmental harms. Environmental justice movement centers on and is led by its predominantly minority and low-income constituents, employing participatory strategies to address direct and disproportionate impacts of environmental harm on their communities. Please enjoy reading and discovering Chapter 7 and let me know if you have any questions.